Well, good morning. Sunday, the 9th of July. You're listening to Sunday Breakfast on BBC Sussex. Did you hear this during the week? The discovery of a Quaker burial ground in Brighton. Well, what's thought to be a Quaker burial ground at the site of an old Quaker's croft just next to the Brighton Dome, where they've got some big renovation work going on. Well, the discovery of what's thought to be a Quaker burial ground during renovation work to the Brighton Corn Exchange is being described by archaeologists as a significant find, shining light on an important moment in the city. The remains of several skeletons have been found under the area that was formerly the venue's mini-conference room. It's believed they're from a 200-year-old Quaker burial site, which was there before the Royal Pavilion estate was built. Dr Paula Ponce from Archaeology South East is glad to be involved in the project in the city where she lives.
We can see the grave cuts of at least another 5-6 individuals. So probably we are waiting for some demolishing of some walls and redistribution of the buildings in the area. So once that happens, then we'll see whether we come across with more. But so far, as I said, we found 2 males, 1 female, with the kind of classical pathologies or diseases that you would expect for a post-medieval population. So I've seen a lot of dental disease, I've seen joint disease, some sort of metabolic disease as well. But it's not until we recover them and we wash them that I will be able to lay the skeleton on the table and be able to see more in detail for some evidence of trauma, cancer, and so forth.
Extraordinary stuff. Well, I've been along to the nearby Friends Meeting House in Ship Street to meet resident warden Terry Byrne and get his reaction to this discovery.
The council rang us up and told us about it, and I think there was a bit of disbelief at first because we knew about the burial ground. We know from our records about the burial ground, but we weren't exactly sure of the exact location of it. So we were really, really thrilled and excited by it.
The Quakers are based now here in Ship Street, where we're talking, but you were much closer to the Brighton Dome, where the renovations are taking place at that time.
The meeting house, before this one was built in 1805, stood on North Street at what is now the corner with New Road. It was an old malt house which they converted about 1700 to use as a Quaker meeting house. The land, they had quite a bit of land extending behind it, which right up to Church Street, and it was right at the far end of that land where they had as a burial ground.
So we know this burial ground was used in the 18th century. What do we know about Quakers in Brighton at that time?
They were quite a insular group. It's that period in history, 18th century, early 19th century, is known as the quietest period in Quaker history, where all the early dynamism of the 17th century Quakers, all that activity and fire which sort of drove the early Quakers to found Quakerism, had sort of died down. They'd become, what's the word, quite used to quite comfortable lives, really. And they became quite insular in that they're married within themselves. There was quite some strong Quaker families, and they all kept it to themselves, really. Anybody who married outside the society was actually thrown out of the society.
So Quakers have come on a bit since then, have they?
Yes, indeed, yes. I mean, in the mid-19th century, there was quite a lot of movement in that the Quakers nationally were affected by the evangelical movement, which was sweeping, I think, through all churches, Methodism, Anglicanism, and Quakers got caught up with that and thrived from that, really, yes. Yeah.
So going back to the site of the burial ground, we know at the moment several skeletons have been uncovered. Are we likely to know who these people are?
There's a good chance that we might be able to find out. We certainly got good records from 1805 when the meeting was moved to this site in Ship Street, and they began burying people here at the meeting house here. We've got to do some research, we've got to do some delving and trying to find out more. There might well be registers somewhere of who they are, who's buried in this burial ground.
And what more do you hope to find out about these people and about the Quakers at that time?
It would be wonderful to know the lifestyles, really. I think nowadays we have an idea or a thought that maybe Quakers in those days were quite, maybe not puritanical, but lived very simply and austerely. And it would be just good to know how they did live, how they ate, what their health was like, and also about what they died with, what diseases they were likely to have. We think they were probably, even though they lived simply, they were probably quite well off people. So that would be interesting to find out if that was reflected in the state of the bones as they're being found. At the time when the prince was anxious to expand the royal estate, the Quakers were thinking to move out of that property anyway because their numbers had grown. They were looking to find a new property, new land to build a new meeting house, so it all fitted in quite well. Quakers have always believed passionately, really passionately, because in the early days they were persecuted for it, in equality. And equality, everybody's equal, nobody is above the other. So it would have been interesting to know how they got on with the king and the prince and his associates. There is a record of the prince coming across a Quaker and asking how he was, and the Quaker replied, "I am very well, thank thee, George," and we just referred to him by his name, not by any royal title. There's an interesting story about the graveyard itself, the burial ground, in that there seems to have been a bit of a dispute between Marie Fitzherbert and the Quakers about that land. She had property overlooking the burial ground, and she opened up a window in the wall which abutted the ground and put a window in, and the Quakers were very unhappy about that and thought it was unacceptable to have a window overlooking the burial ground. They appointed a committee who met with Mrs. Fitzherbert, and she was very reluctant to block the window up, so they agreed for a charge she would pay a rent, I think it's a penny a month, for the privilege of having a window overlooking the burial ground.
So they were amicable in the end?
Yes, and the Quakers happily moved to this present site in 1805, 1806. I went with a colleague yesterday, and I think we both feel really privileged to have been invited. They invited us to go and have a look, and we met the site manager and we met the archaeologists, who were absolutely fascinating, really, what they could tell us already about what they've seen on initial viewing of these bones. And we found it completely fascinating, and I suppose quite moving that we saw the bones of our predecessors, really, as Quakers in Brighton. I think the two of us who went, we just came away just moved, deeply moved.
How do you feel about the fact that these graves have been exhumed and the skeletons are being moved? Is there any Quaker tradition that would be disapproving of this?
Not as far as I'm aware of. It has been done before in Brighton. The burial ground here in Ship Street was closed in 1856, and Quakers started to bury people then up at Black Rock in East Brighton. And then that burial ground was closed in the 1960s when they were building the approach road to the marina, and all those bodies were then exhumed and taken up to Woodingdean, where there's still a Quaker burial ground. So as far as I'm aware, there is certainly no problem with this happening. Yeah.
You may be in a different location now, but Quakers do have a presence still in the heart of Brighton. It's described by some as a quiet space in the heart of Brighton, this building that we're sitting in now in Ship Street. As I walked through the door today, it seemed like a hive of activity, lots of different things going on. Tell me more about what you do in this building now and how you operate at the Friends Meeting House.
I think primarily the Quakers see the building as a place of worship. It's where we meet 4 times a week to gather for worship. But Quakers are always quite careful to say it's not a consecrated space like a church might be considered. There are no special parts to it. There is no altar or sanctuary. The whole building is simple and ready to use, really, and it gets used by many different groups from many different backgrounds. Today we've got a big Brighton Housing Trust event going on. The local authority uses for training, local NHS uses for training and for conferences. We have a lot of 12-step groups meeting here, lots of support groups, children's charities. We're getting emails every day from different groups who want to come into the space. And that's really why the building is maintained, really, to reach out to older community and support the community.
And if people want to come and experience Quaker worship, what will they find?
They will find I'm hoping they will find a welcoming community. As I say, we have 4 meetings for worship a week. The main one is at 10:30, and the main one on Sunday. And the main one is where more people are. More people have got time to talk after meeting, and there's tea and coffee. There's always a warm welcome. We're always aware that Quakerism doesn't speak to everybody who comes through the doors, but whatever your background, you don't have to have any religious background, or you may have a religious background in another faith, but everybody's welcome.
That was Terry Byrne from the Brighton Quakers speaking to me earlier this week, giving his reaction to this rather curious discovery of what's thought to be a Quaker burial ground.